Good evening and welcome to A Slice of Life. Tonight's subject is once again the American chestnut and the efforts to bring it back from the very brink of extinction. Tonight we have Mr. Jack Swat, the president of the Connecticut chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, and he's here to tell us what the foundation is doing. Jack Swat, welcome to A Slice of Life.
Yeah, thank you.
What's going on with the American chestnut?
Well, our foundation's been working for 40 years now in trying to develop a chestnut tree that's resistant to the blight that came over here in the early 1900s. So we have several different programs that we're using to try to develop that disease-resistant tree. Our foundation started with a program trying to use American and Chinese chestnut hybrid trees. Since the Chinese chestnut trees have resistance to the blight, our founders developed a plan to use the hybrid trees to get the genes for resistance from the Asian trees, but still develop a tree that's tall and grows like the American chestnut so it could succeed in our eastern forests. Here in Connecticut, we've been started off working with that backcross program. We take the hybrid tree and we cross it several generations with American chestnut trees. So each step of the way we try to test it for blight resistance. So that way we have the most blight resistant trees carrying through to the next generation. Here in Connecticut, we started 7 what we call backcross orchards. The first one, I believe, was planted back in 2010. And when those trees grow to maturity and they start to develop flowers, we then test them for blight resistance. And then the seeds that we obtain from those orchards, we plant in our next generation orchard, which we're calling seed orchards. And we currently have 3 seed orchards in Connecticut, different locations throughout the state. So
now, is the American chestnut tree greatly different from the Asian tree in the way it looks?
Yes, the American tree is a tree that grew in the forest. It was very tall and it grew very straight, straight-trunked. The Asian varieties, both the Japanese chestnut and the Chinese chestnut, were more like orchard trees. They were shorter, highly branched. There are a lot of differences in the leaves that we can tell, but with hybrid trees, sometimes it's not as easy to tell them apart.
Right.
And the nuts are different too. The Chinese and Japanese nuts are very large, whereas American chestnuts were actually very small, about half the size of the Asian varieties. But they've done nutritional studies too and found that the American chestnuts were much more nutritious and had healthier fatty acids and everything than the Asian varieties. So back in the day, it was a very important source of food for wildlife and even for people too. So,
as a note, I read that in my research that the American chestnut tree was never actually commercially grown because they were so plentiful in the forest.
Yep, correct, yeah. Yep, the early Appalachian farmers used to just go out in the forest during the fall and collect the nuts and just ship them to the cities where they'd be roasted for the holidays and everything, and saved for their own purposes as well.
Right.
Yeah, but it was so abundant.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So abundant. Some of the early surveys of the forest showed that the American chestnut, 1 out of every 4 trees in the forest was a chestnut. So, and it provided nuts every year. Produced a huge crop of nuts.
That is a staggering dominance.
Yeah,
I must say. I don't think any tree nowadays comes even close.
No, even like oaks sometimes may have a huge crop of acorns every 2 or 3 years.
Right.
But the American chestnut was regularly every year that supplied nuts.
What a shame the blight came. Mm-hmm. So now, let's go to the videos. I went and visited you in one of your research orchards, I guess you'd call it.
Yep. This is one of our backcross orchards, yeah.
Oh,
yep, one of our test orchards, yeah.
So let's talk about that. Here we go.
Yep.
Is
in
it
this
coming
orchard,
on the back?
Yeah, this type of an orchard, we plant hundreds of nuts that were probably grown in our research farm in Meadowview, Virginia.
Right.
And then the last backcrossing with an American tree, we wanted to do with Connecticut American chestnut trees. So that way the trees behaved and we're able to survive in Connecticut's climate, which is much different than the one in Virginia. So.
Now I'm looking at these flowers that we just saw on the video, and are they wind pollinated or bumblebee pollinated?
Yep, they're primarily wind pollinated.
Oh.
So American chestnut doesn't self-pollinate, so in order to get fertile nuts you need a tree probably at least a half-mile away, and the pollen just blows in the wind. So
kind of like corn, I would say.
Yeah. They suspect that their moths may have been taken part in some pollination as well, but most of the moths that were specific to chestnut have disappeared with the demise. So we have found a chestnut bee that is relies on chestnut flowers to continue its life cycle, but we believe they just collect the pollen and use it in their nest. They don't provide any pollination.
Oh.
But we're still studying that, so yeah.
You know, there's a lot of different people studying this. So how's the backcross program going?
Yep, we've our founder thought that there were maybe 3 or 4 genes responsible for resistance when he developed the backcross program.
Right.
So suspected that after 3 generations of backcrossing and 2 more generations of forward crossing, we would have a tree that was just as resistant as the Chinese-American hybrids that we started with. However,
that would seem to follow.
Yeah, but with a lot more advances in genetics, we're able to study it, and we've sequenced the entire genome of both the American chestnut and the Chinese chestnut, and we're locating areas on the chromosomes that are responsible for blight resistance. And we realized that it's probably more like dozens of genes responsible for blight resistance.
Wow.
So conserving all of those genes through the back-crossing process was not as easy as we had suspected.
That sounds like a staggering process.
Yeah. Yep. But now in each, at the end of, or sorry, not at the end, but when the orchard matures, they go through a test where we actually inoculate them with the blight fungus and test to see how well the trees resist the blight infection.
Well, so, I actually have video of that.
Yep.
Because during my visit at the orchard, that's what they were doing. Mm-hmm. Can we see? There we go. Now, could you explain what's going on here?
Yep, here we've, what we do is we cut a small hole in the bark of the chestnut tree in 2 different places using a cork borer. And then we take a small disc of the fungus that's being grown on auger. I think you might be able to see them applying it with a spatula right there into the hole created by the cork borer. And then that inoculates the tree with 2 specific strains of blight fungus. So every tree in our program goes through testing with these same 2 strains of the fungus. So that way we compare resistance even between orchards to see which trees are the most resistant.
Wow. Now, when do you go back to these sites to check on them?
Yeah, over the next 2 years, our science coordinator will come back and they'll take a look at the blight infection, what we call cankers, and rate them on a scale from 0 to 5. So ones that show very little canker size are showing resistance, and those will be graded higher than ones that show much larger cankers.
So now, can one assume that the inoculation sites that come back with 0 or 1, do they have genes that came from the Asian trees that are helping them resist?
Yep, that's what the hope is. That's how these tests were designed, so that we want to conserve as much of the resistance genes as we can.
Right.
Well, as I mentioned, we started out with planting hundreds of nuts in these orchards, but then the ones that don't show resistance, we'll actually cull those trees and get rid of them, so we'll be left with maybe about a dozen or 2 dozen trees that show the best resistance.
That's a small percentage.
Then we will cross them with other trees that show resistance, so each step of the way, the next generation should have more resistance than the prior. So
what I want to bring out here is that, you know, you did this inoculation probably about 2 months ago or so, and you're going back in 2 years. This takes a long time.
Yes, yeah.
It's not like growing peas with the gene experiment back in with the monk or something.
That's right. Yeah. After we plant these trees, they don't start flowering until about 5 to 8 years after we plant them.
Wow.
And we want the trees to grow enough to a certain size diameter that we can inoculate them with the fungus then too. So Yeah, this is, and since there's several generations of back crossing, and that's why we've been in it for 40 years already, and
Right.
still continuing the process.
I guess the saving grace here is that the rootstock doesn't die off with the
Yep,
fungus.
exactly.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, when the fungus came through back in the early 1900s, it killed the bark, and then that's what the fungus eats, is the dead bark, and then it
Right.
girdles the stems of the tree. But chestnut is one of the trees that has the ability to sprout from its roots. So after the fungus killed the tree and the trees fell, the roots continued to send up sprouts from the ground, from the roots. And since the blight fungus is still here, these sprouts will get to maybe on average about 15 to 20 foot tall, and then they will get the blight again, and the fungus attacks them, it kills the stems again. It'll continually send up new sprouts. So it's constantly in a cycle of sprouting and then dying back to the ground
Right.
again. So we call that functionally extinct.
Right.
It's rarely growing tall enough to the point where it will flower and reproduce. Since it needs a lot of sunlight to produce the nuts and flower, it's very rare that trees will be growing in high light conditions.
Right.
We do find a lot of wild trees that do flower in areas that have been disturbed, either naturally or man-made.
Right.
So areas where storms have blown down a lot of trees, power line right-of-ways, clear cuts, even along roadsides we might find flowering American chestnut trees. When we do find them, they also have to have another source of pollen since they don't self-pollinate.
Right.
So sometimes we find trees and they produce infertile nuts. So we've started bringing pollen to them so that way we could obtain fertile nuts.
Right. Well, now, let's talk about the bags. I was at the Old Lyme Library recently, and there's a tree, American chestnut tree there with all these bags all over it. I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah, this is a tree that is undergoing the pollination process manually.
Yeah.
This is an American chestnut tree that was actually I believe it was transplanted there back in the 1990s. And it's growing in good sunlight, so it's flowered. It has gotten the blight, and the original trunk has died, but other trunks have sprouted up around it.
Yeah.
And it's continually growing enough so that it's constantly flowering. The problem is there are other Japanese chestnut and Chinese chestnuts growing nearby, so it was producing hybrid nuts.
Right.
So what we have to do to pollinate it with American pollen is to actually cover the flowers, the female flowers, with bags to prevent the other Asian pollen from fertilizing the flowers before we can get to them. So we place those bags on them at a certain point in their development,
Right.
and then we go back about a week, maybe 10 days later, and we remove the bags and then apply pollen to them, either from fresh catkins from another tree that's producing pollen, or from slides that where we've collected pollen in the past, applied it to the slides, or even freeze it, or just apply it directly to the slides.
Now, if somebody wants to help you, how do they get in touch with you? They go to the...
We do have a website where we have a place that says contact us. Our email address, I believe, is ctchapter@tacf.org to email us.
Right.
And we definitely want to know, especially if there's flowering trees. Just this week, I've gotten 3 reports of trees that have flowered that we want to investigate.
Yeah.
So we'll either ask them to send a leaf and stem sample to our science coordinator, just so we can confirm that it is an American chestnut and not a hybrid, or we may have volunteers in the area who may be able to go and look at it and determine.
Now, can you
if it's
tell
an
just by
American
looking
tree.
at the leaves, are they all very kind of the same?
The Chinese chestnut and Japanese chestnut, the leaves are shorter and wider. They all have teeth on the edges. But the American chestnut tree is much longer and narrower. We call it more like canoe-shaped. It's pretty obvious when you compare a leaf to the other one. But we actually look at structures on the undersurface of the leaf and the hair arrangements to actually determine if it's truly an American chestnut rather than a hybrid. So
That's wild. Now, do you have a lot of volunteers?
Yep, we do, yeah.
When
Quite
I
a few
was
throughout
there
the state,
at the inoculation day, there was a lot of volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
And do they have to be highly educated, or can they just be passionate?
Nope, this is all on-the-job training. So
Yeah,
I started out just learning from just observing and talking with our science coordinators, and over the years gained a lot of knowledge, and I'm trying to spread that to all our other volunteers to help them learn.
I actually went with, I think I went with you once into the forest,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot of people there. They were very passionate, and they were certainly dedicated to the process of bringing the American chestnut back.
Yep, we do have quite a few members throughout the state, and also even the volunteers in the other states too. We have 16 chapters, which are either a single state or 2 states combined to form a chapter. And in each of those states, they're doing the same type of programs where we're planting the backcross orchards and growing trees for the backcross program. And then again, we're looking for wild trees to collect nuts from.
Right.
We're also trying to just conserve American chestnut germplasm, since
What is germplasm?
Germplasm is just the genetic material from individual trees.
Oh.
So our goal is to be able to bring the chestnut back to the forests, and if you want to reestablish a population, you need a genetically diverse population.
Oh.
So every day, with development, they're probably tearing out chestnut roots to build new, centers and homes and everything.
Right.
And not knowing what's in the ground there. So we've also know that over time, the roots lose energy and may not re-sprout after a while.
Right.
So it's already been over 100 years since the blight came through. We don't know how much longer these root systems will keep sprouting if they're not getting a lot of light and producing a lot of energy.
But don't you get new pure American chestnut nuts to continue the process, or are they all?
Yeah, but in the wild, they're not growing from seed. In the wild, they're just growing from, very rarely maybe, the wildlife will eat the nuts, but they'll cache them, and only the ones that don't get eaten may sprout.
Right.
And even in the woods, deer love to eat them. Other animals like to eat the vegetation and everything too. So it's,
if you do the research, and some of the descriptions where they were using shovels to harvest the nuts from the forest floor.
There were so many, yeah.
Not just picking them up. They needed shovels.
Yeah.
There was that much abundance. So it's clearly it fed a lot of wildlife.
I always ask people if they recall going hiking in the fall when it's a very high acorn crop and they're just walking all over,
Crunch, crunch.
acorns. That's what it used to be like every year with chestnuts, just walking all over,
what a
acorns
shame.
all over everywhere. Yep.
Yeah. Now you mentioned earlier chestnuts that weren't fertile.
Yeah.
How do you determine that they're not fertile? Do they look?
Well, when they grow, the chestnuts are plump and round that are fertile, and if they're not fertilized, they're just very flat and thin.
Oh.
So
Now
you
is
can
that
tell right
because
away
they
by
weren't
looking at them.
fertilized, or they just they got a bad connection or something?
If we find a tree with nuts in the fall and every one of them looks like that flat infertile nut, then we know there's not another tree nearby to pollinate them. So that's when we know we have to bring pollen to it. If there's other areas, some of the areas in the state where they've done habitat management and done clear cuts, if there were chestnut sprouts growing in that area, they're all flowering at the same time, so they're cross-pollinating each other then. So then it's easier. We can go in and just harvest the nuts and have fertile nuts. So
now, when you bag these things like on the tree, and at the Old Lyme Library, how long does it take after you hand pollinate? How long does it take to grow a mature nut?
Yeah, well, the nuts basically mature on their own. They develop in structures called burrs, which are very, they have a lot of sharp spines on them.
Right.
I think it's a good safety thing to keep the squirrels from getting to them before they're matured.
Right.
But there's 3 nuts in each burr.
Oh.
When they're fertilized, up to 3 nuts, I should say. And they usually open up, in Connecticut, they open up like the first week of August and the nuts will fall out. So we try to get them before then, so the last 2 weeks of September, we'll go to the various trees and collect for the lime tree, we'll collect the bags ahead of time and just, cut the bags off the end of the branch there, and then wait for them to just continue drying and opening up, and they'll open up in the bag, so then we'll have all the nuts there.
Now, I noticed when I was there that there were two different kinds of bags. And I was wondering if that's just accidental, or is there a purpose there?
Yeah, we do two different types of pollen on that tree. So each different color represents the different pollen that we used. There also are something we call control bags. For every 10 bags of flowers that we pollinate, we also put a bag on as a control and don't pollinate the nuts in those, or the flowers in those bags. That way we can be assured that we bagged them ahead of time, that they didn't get any extraneous pollen from some of those other trees. So in the control, we don't expect fertile nuts, and in the other bags, we do expect fertile nuts.
That is remarkable. Like, it's the kind of work that's in like a real science lab, but you're doing it out in the world and out and all for everybody to see, and it's just amazing.
Yeah, that's one of the things that led me, or encouraged me to continue working with the American Chestnut Foundation, is that it is a lot of science background going into helping this tree survive.
Are you a scientist in your background?
I'm actually a physician assistant working in medicine.
Oh, wow.
So with my medical background, this is just another disease that I feel that we're fighting, the blight disease. So.
Well, yeah, that's actually a good comparison.
Yep, and there's, as I mentioned, there's a lot of genetics involved. Right now we're doing a lot of this conservation with the germplasm conservation orchards, because we're also starting to look into transgenics, using genetic engineering to come up with a plan to help the trees develop resistance. So.
I read an annual report that the Bronx Zoo gave me, and they went through the processes of trying to save the trees and crossbreeding and stuff, and I have to imagine they had no idea it was so complex, and it would be such a daunting challenge.
Yeah. I think they knew right away it was going to be devastating.
Yeah.
They initially tried to use whatever fungicides they had available at that time on the tree.
Yes, that's true, yeah.
And nothing worked. So
nothing worked.
They were recording how fastly it spread from the Bronx Zoo. It came through in the higher southern New England region within a matter of like 5 to 10 years. And then slowly went down the entire Appalachian range, and I think by 1950.
And you got to feel for the people that depended on the tree.
Yep, exactly.
And depended on that massive amount of nuts every year. I mean, they fed their pigs, they fed their children, they sold them.
Yep.
It was part of the big economy up in the mountains.
And at this time, this was down south, this was the time of the Great Depression too. So not only did they get hit with the Great Depression, they also lost the chestnuts that were so vital to their survival
as well. Double whammy there.
Yep, exactly, yeah. So it really
So
hit
going
hard.
forward, continue testing, more orchards, more?
Yep, we'll continue testing. We're still trying to refine our backcross breeding program. As I mentioned, if we found out that there's so many genes involved, we need to add some more of them back. So we're continuing to refine our backcross breeding program so that we have the most resistant trees, breeding with the most resistant trees, and trying to improve that to get better outcomes. As I mentioned, we're also looking into transgenics and trying to develop chestnut trees that would be basically 99.99% American trees, but also contain resistance genes from either Chinese chestnut or from other organisms that will help them fight off the blight. We're also looking more into the fungus itself and seeing if there are ways that we can help combat the infection from the fungus. So there's definitely a lot of scientific research involved. So
if you're curious about learning more about the progress of the American Chestnut Foundation, I would go to the website, AmericanChestnut.org?
TACF.org, theamericanchestnutfoundation.org.
Okay, so TACF, there you go, TACF.org. And like so many other websites I've encountered, there's a lot of information there, and if you want to get involved, hook them up. They all have contact information, and maybe you could go and help Jack Swat out in the field someday, and he would be grateful, I would assume.
Yes, be very grateful for
get
any
more
help we
people
can
out
get.
there.
Yes, yep.
When I was there was a lot of white hair in that group, so I was thankful when at the inoculation site where there were some young people there.
Yeah, that is
But,
true. A lot of our volunteers are retirees who have the time during the daytime, but we do like to try to recruit a lot of younger people too.
Yeah.
We've been doing a lot of outreach over the years in some of the local fairs. We go to the Durham Fair every year, the Hartford Flower and Garden Show.
Oh, excellent.
We're also trying to get out in the schools to, like I said, teach the younger crowd, the next generation of scientists who can help us with this. So.
All right, so that's going to be our story on our show on the American Chestnut Part 2. And again, if you have any questions, go to the website, tacf.org, and they will be happy to accept your volunteerism. That's it for now. Jack Swat, thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you very much for having me.
We appreciate you coming in. We appreciate what you're doing to try to help the American chestnut.
Thank you.
That's it. Good night.